say a few words here to get us started. So we're gonna, we have one bit of testimony this morning, and it's on the enrollment of reserve forest land in the current use program. This is something, a report that I think we may have gotten a report last year. It may have just been an update. So some of this will sound familiar. 4 years ago, I believe it was 2022, the legislature created this new category for current use. And I think, also instructed the department to give us an update, or the agency to give us an update from time to time. So be curious to see where things stand with that. Once we finish that, we don't have any other testimony today. I do want to just have a little discussion with the committee about S323 and our plans for that as we get to a point where we'll need to vote that out with an amendment and get it back to the Senate before they wrap things up. John.
I just saw Esme in the hall, and she had an update on EPA sending a letter on paraquat.
Oh, yes.
Did you see that?
Yeah. Yep.
So,
it wasn't EPA, it was 8 former EPA high-level administrators sent a letter to EPA saying it's time to just ban this federally.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's what she was referring to.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, Keith, welcome. Nice to have you back.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's go ahead and get started.
Great. For the record, my name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. I'll be testifying on the status of enrollment of reserve forest land in the Use Value Appraisal Program, largely drawing from a legislative report that the department submitted to the legislature at the beginning of this session. I'll start off with a bit of context. The chair already gave a little bit of background, but in 2022, Act 146 was passed, which established a new subcategory of managed forest land called reserve forest land. Reserve forest land is an enrollment subcategory of managed forest land. Lands enrolled in this subcategory need to be managed for the accrual and attainment of old forest conditions. Old forest conditions are historically the kind of natural condition of our forest land with European settlement and agricultural conversion and a lot of uses that changed. And old forest as a condition represents less than 1% of our total forest land across the state today. Old forest characteristics provide really important contributions to native biodiversity, wildlife habitat, hydrologic regulation, carbon storage, forest resilience, and localized cooling and climate buffering. This isn't just because they're old, it's because of the characteristics that are unique to forests that have been allowed to accrue these characteristics. These characteristics include large old trees, spatial variability in tree density, abundant down dead wood, multiple canopy layers, large standing dead trees, regeneration, lots of young trees, and unique plant communities. It's important to stress that these contributions are not exclusive to old forest. They can develop and accrue in actively managed forests, but the nature of some of these contributions can be unique to old forests and thus are valuable.
John?
Were there any projections whether this program went forward or going forward, or just the way forests are maturing in Vermont? So do we know, like you said, 1% now, like in 10 years, is there a projection on what percentage will have these same characteristics?
There are different projections. I think some work by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro, they have a publication called Managing for Old Forest Characteristics or Old Growth Characteristics. And they look at kind of on average, our general forest conditions on average were between 80 and 100-year-old forests. And old forest characteristics, and it depends on the forest type and different disturbance regimes, but old forest characteristics kind of accrue a large tree threshold around 200 years. And so it takes a long time, and that's with passive management where there's no active intervention. That can be sped up with active management closer to 150 years because you're actively giving individual trees space to grow, and they're growing faster as a result. There are trade-offs with carbon and other factors that can influence that timing. And there are other characteristics that there are trade-offs with if you're actively harvesting individual trees in order to create growing space for others.
It'd be interesting to see a timeline, say from, 1800 with old growth, what percentage of Vermont is old growth, and then it drops off to zero, and why?
I think it would be starting before 1800 if we're looking at that curve.
Yeah, and it's more or less since Vermont was deforested, has it remained at like 1% for a long time?
I think that's generally true. I think what we've got today is what we've had for a long time. Though there are places that are really certainly accruing the characteristics. We'll never get old growth forests back again, but with intentional management and an intentional approach, we can accrue those characteristics, which are really important for our forests, just like young forest is also important for the goals we've got for the resilience, wildlife habitat, and all the values we want from our forest land.
And FPR is there a target, sort of what percentage would be good?
Agency of Natural Resources has a target, and it's embodied in Vermont Conservation Design. And so it's got kind of these paired forest structure targets. Young forest is a target, looking for 3 to 5% of the state's forest land being in a young forest condition, ballparking at about 10% of Vermont's forest being in an old forest condition. And certainly there's a whole lot of room for the in-between in there. Thank you.
John had a question.
Yes.
Your last slide lists characteristics of old forests, and it mentions first large old trees, which is how I would picture it. So if you have all these large old trees, how do you get multiple canopy layers?
So the large old trees, this is, I think, one of the things we often joke about when we're showing a picture of old forest is the big old tree is the one that we feel like represents that longevity. But the reality is when that tree dies, there is a massive gap in the canopy, which then gets filled by new young trees. And so the spatial variability is where you get both large old trees and lots and lots of young trees. And so you have in a given acre, you might have 10 or 15 large big trees, but you are also surrounded by thousands of young trees of various
The tree dies.
What's that?
When the old tree dies.
Yes. Yeah. Part of the history of this is, as we recognize that the agency has targets for both young forest and old forest characteristics, we look at the use value appraisal program across the landscape. It is so successful in its engagement of landowners, in its support of working lands, that it's hard to imagine having goals for our forest land and being successful in achieving those if they're not compatible with enrollment in use value appraisal. And old forest, because it takes hundreds of years to develop, it does take a different management approach on some lands to achieve that successfully and to achieve it at scale, not just on a few acres here and there, but across multiple parcels, contiguous acres. That's where you get a lot of that value. At the time, during the discussion, the legislative discussion, the question was, how do we get more than a small portion of a parcel eligible for management for old forest characteristics? At that time, ecologically significant treatment areas, like think riparian areas, think vernal pools, existing old forests. You could have a portion of any parcel enrolled in that way and managed for old forest characteristics, but you could never have an entire parcel unless it was enrolled in the conservation category, subcategory of managed forest land. You could never have an entire parcel managed for old forest. So this was part of the context of that discussion. And so we recognize that there's a real potential tension between managing for old forest, which at a minimum probably requires less harvesting. And at times it is appropriate, if old forest is your goal, that there will be some places where it's appropriate to not actively harvest trees for a period of time to achieve old forest. That is in tension with the primary purpose of use value appraisal, of maintaining working lands and managing for forest products.
Intention, you said.
Yes.
ENSION.
There is a tension and so the intention behind the design of reserve forest land at that time was, one, don't screw up UVA. Keep the primary purpose of managing for forest products, working lands, paramount for the program. And can we do both at the same time, also increase opportunities to achieve old forest on UVA enrolled forest land at a scale and pattern that helps Vermont benefit from old forest values and functions?
Did you have a question, John?
It's sort of what you're talking about. So I just wondered if anecdotally, since the start of UVA, was there tension between certain property owners, and their forester or county foresters? Like, because we all have these management plans that more or less talk about harvest at a certain time.
Yeah.
And there's a timeline. But were there certain property owners who said, I want my plan to be, don't touch my forest?
I can't imagine that there was a time when that wasn't the case. I do think that we have seen culturally that I think that there's been a shift towards that sentiment. And that's difficult to navigate because everybody has, we want them to love their forest. Their love for their forest is independent of, how it's going to be managed. And we want to support them in that. And at the same time, as a voluntary program, how they love their forest, how they want to manage it may or may not be eligible for enrollment in the program. And it doesn't mean that everything is prescriptive, but there is accountability to active management on lands enrolled in the program.
And John Bartholomew.
I'm just curious, on your map, there's this conspicuous void north-south. What is that?
That's the forest.
Those are state lands and federal lands. Yep, so that's the southern sections are largely Green Mountain National Forest.
Is chaired there.
That does not mean that we don't have useful forest.
Correct. It is, those are gaps in eligible or enrolled lands as opposed to gaps in forest land. So to thread the needle on maintaining the working lands goals of the program, while also achieving some opportunities for some lands to be managed for old forest, the criteria for reserve forest land basically established that certain parcels with a critical threshold of what we called significant or sensitive conditions could be eligible for enrollment in the program. And the way that the legislature passed it was that parcels with 100 acres, more than 100 acres or equal to 100 acres, they had to have 30% of the parcels enrolled acres would need to be comprised of significant and sensitive conditions. Significant and sensitive conditions would include conditions that either create barriers to successful and active management or are ecologically significant enough to warrant management for other goals. And think about rare, threatened, endangered habitats, think about wetlands or extremely steep slopes. these are the conditions that can, if present on a property, could contribute to its eligibility for enrollment in reserve forest land. If a parcel satisfies this threshold, so let's say it's a 150 acre parcel and 75 acres of it are significant and sensitive conditions, then the entirety of the parcel could be managed for old forest characteristics, not just the 75 that kind of bring it in, but its entirety. So it was through this and through some modeling that we were able to evaluate how much actual land is eligible based on these criteria. Does this maintain, how frequent will this be? Are these real barriers to active management? And produce a report that the legislature evaluated at the time and proceeded based on that.
Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, just quickly, because of Act 181 Tier 3 conversations, I just wondered if wildlife corridors and sort of certain important habitats, did they come into these conditions?
So not in this. What we wanted to do was not reinvent the wheel. We had existing ecologically significant treatment areas. I do think that was potential overlap in some of those conditions, but corridors were not expressly considered. Significant wildlife habitat is an enrollment subcategory of use value appraisal, but it's expressly not a significant and sensitive condition. But there are the ecologically significant treatment areas, significant natural communities, RT&E, rare, threatened, and endangered habitats, riparian areas, those would contribute.
Would deer wintering yards be considered one of those subcategories?
Not for significant and sensitive conditions, no. No, it would be, could be considered a significant wildlife habitat for enrollment in use value appraisal, but in significant wildlife habitat, you still need to actively manage for saw timber, even while you may be prioritizing advancing the habitat values of the site.
Thank you. Representative Nelson, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Two things at the bottom of the slide. Site for lands and special places, I guess.
Yes.
Anyone could say this place is special to me, but so site for lands is special places.
Yeah, so site for lands, soils are classified into site 1, 2, or 3 soil, 1, 2, 3, or 4 soils. Site for soils are largely wetland soils. They could also be very shallow soils. Basically, they're not capable of producing a certain volume of wood on a given site. So they don't have a lot of forest management potential. Special places and sensitive sites, these are generally very small. They are defined in standards. Think Native American burial sites, cemeteries, things of really important cultural recognition, but often very small in nature.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So that's the background of this, and I can dig into the enrollment status unless anybody has other context questions.
Let's keep going. We can come back afterwards if other thoughts come up.
Okay. So at this point, we have 55 parcels, or at the time we wrote the report, we had 55 parcels and about 11,000 acres enrolled among the parcels that had taken on this reserve forest land category. Of those enrollments, 36 of them were already enrolled in use value appraisal, so they were transitioning from an active management category into this reserve forest land category. And so that comprises about 8,000 acres. About 19 parcels are new to enrollment in UVA since the creation of reserve forest land, totaling about 3,500 acres. The average parcel size for lands enrolled in use value in reserve forest land are a little bit larger than the average parcel, about 218 acres. And currently, the enrollments represent about 0.3% of forest land parcels enrolled in the program and 0.6% of the total forest land acres enrolled in the program. In terms, yeah,
Just quickly in context, right? So Vermont has what, over 6 million acres?
yeah, so we've got about 3.5 million acres of private land, private forest land, 4.5 million acres of forest land.
And how much in UVA?
2 million acres, so I can jump back to this slide. There's about 2.8 million acres that we believe to be eligible for enrollment in the program. And about 2 million acres of forest land are currently enrolled.
Pretty high.
Pretty high, about 70% of what we estimate to be eligible acres are currently enrolled. It's about 55% of parcels, so the larger parcels definitely tend to be enrolled.
So that 10,000 acres is a tiny percentage.
It's a small percentage, yep. It is interesting when you look at the whole, it's a small percentage, but these are not hypothetical places. They are real parcels on the ground that people have a history of managing, that people have a history of connecting with, that have been enrolled in the program, and they are not hypothetical. And so it's one thing to look at the numbers. It's another thing to know that this is a place on the ground that is going to be managed for a certain purpose that may be different than what folks hope for or expect for, or will celebrate that, depending on their perspective.
Just quickly keep thinking, almost like conservation easements. So we're talking 150 to 200 years of management to get to this aspiration. So if somebody, say, we're going to talk generational successions here, so 3 generations down the road, that family wants to, say, go back to more of an active management, is there a penalty for withdrawing but staying in UVA?
There is no penalty, and that was one of the things. You can go back and forth, and the conversation we had at the time was if the management for old forest characteristics advances program purposes when it's within the confines of the eligibility that was created, and active management for saw timber advances program purposes, then do we need to weight one over the other? And oftentimes the allowance to accrue those old forest characteristics may create opportunities for active management that didn't exist eventually. And so that was one of the discussions. There are many who might say, if we really care about old forest characteristics, then that durability, that longevity is really necessary. But one of the benefits of use value appraisal is its flexibility and is the relatively modest risk within the sideboards of working lands not being developed. You have a range of options to manage it.
And just to follow up, saying if I withdraw 10 acres to put in a sawmill, it's the same penalty for pulling out of UVA, whether it's a traditional UVA or whether it's reserved.
That is true. And so that would be considered development, and it would get the land use change tax applied in the same way that any other development would, right or wrong. I think it's in considering the total enrollment and where we're at, we've got some estimates about how much land could potentially be eligible for enrollment in reserve forest land. At the time in 2022, we had run some numbers. It's a pretty involved model, so we haven't rerun these numbers, but at the time estimated that about 690,000 total acres, this is of total eligible land, not just enrolled land, but 690,000 acres could be eligible for enrollment in among about 4,000 parcels. Of that 690,000 acres, we've got this term we're calling productive forest land trade-off. And these are lands that are not otherwise eligible in UVA under something other than an active management approach. So lands that would be among the 690,000 eligible acres, but not among the productive forest land trade-off, would be lands that are steep slopes, would be lands that are in riparian areas or Site 4 lands. And so you can imagine that if somebody is enrolling a Site 4 land, might count that towards the reserve forest land total, but you wouldn't count that as a loss of management opportunity. This productive forest land trade-off was a really important number for us to gauge how are we doing in managing these competing objectives of maintaining the integrity of use value appraisal and its working lands goals, while also advancing the goals of supporting old forest accrual in the state. So of the 4,000 estimated parcels that are eligible, we've got 55 that are now enrolled. Of the 690,000 acres that we believe were eligible, we've got 11,000 acres that are not now enrolled. Of the 11,000 acres that are now enrolled in reserve forest land, a little over 5,000 acres are considered that productive forest land trade-off. These are lands that were only eligible under an active management for saw timber approach in UVA. Would not otherwise be eligible as Site 4 lands or the steep slopes or riparian areas. Any questions on that?
I have one question, just because we can never not talk about sugaring in this. Can
Okay,
private owners who say were in UVA forest, but they're declaring a sugar bush to be agricultural, can they get the agricultural tax benefit, which is at a higher rate than forest land management?
If a landowner chooses to enroll their sugar bush in the agricultural side, they can do so. They do not need to
By
have
acre, yeah.
by acre.
Yeah.
They don't need a forest management plan. They're not subject to the certain standards, but they're benefiting from the agricultural use value as opposed to the forest land use value. It does happen. It's not common.
Yeah, I sort of wondered how many acres in Vermont might be.
not common.
It's not common. It's really valuable for smaller parcels that aren't otherwise eligible. There are some folks too who prefer not to have the oversight related to the forest land, the management plan, and that's valuable for them.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of overlap with organic certification and FPR's standards, and so a lot of folks will, because they're already pursuing the certification, it's a very small step to also benefit from the forest land use value.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. So looking at this chart you have here, it looks like it's 47% of this land that's not, it would still be productive land, but it's it could be or has been enrolled in preserved forest.
That's about right. Yep.
And do you you go to the estimated up above, and it's running the same percentage, but it looks to me like a lot of acres. And the interesting part would be on the parcels, how many of those are larger parcels that larger parcels and having a severe impact on on tax rates or on availability to do things. Some productive forest land. I'm just trying to wrap my head around what percentage of the state are we turning into a park instead of into productive lands. That's all.
Okay. I don't know the answer to what percentage we're turning into a park. I don't know what's behind that conclusion about these lands being turned into a park. But these lands have a range of management objectives on them. Many of these parcels are actually being actively managed for accrual of old forest characteristics. Many are also being passively managed without active intervention. Lands that are enrolled in the program, according to the standards, must deal with water quality issues. They must deal with introduced invasive plants. In some cases, they must deal with where there are existing plantations and the diversity is the species diversity and age class diversity is extremely low. They must intervene to accelerate development of old forest characteristics. That's not frequent, but that's the case. This was the legislative directive in terms of kind of what are the percentage of these parcels that would warrant enrollment. So that's how we're administering it. The report does break down how many parcels are 500 acres or more, how many parcels kind of by parcel size, just because that is an important factor when considering potential impacts. You can imagine that if 50% of a 100-acre parcel is manageable, then the trade-off there is different than if it's 50% of a 2,000-acre parcel that is manageable. So that is discussed in the report.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah. Keith, following up on Richard's point, I think for, the forestry community, what we've experienced, and I'd like you to explain to all of us what the difference is, but there are, and they may be conservation easements when people, there've been a number of large parcels, meaning well over 1,000 acres that have been put into a carbon market, for instance, or taken out of UVA. Are they not part of UVA if they have a conservation easement for the carbon market?
Yeah, so there are,
Where there is specifically either no active management for
Okay.
a century or more, and maybe hunting by permission only, or no recreation.
in order for a parcel to be eligible for enrollment, the land that's enrolled needs the ability to be managed for the purposes of the enrollment subcategory in which it's enrolled. And what that means is that if land is enrolled as productive forest land and the standards require that it be actively managed for saw timber, and that landowner has an easement or a legal obligation and they're getting paid for their carbon and they have said, I'm not cutting any trees, that land is not eligible for enrollment in productive forest land. However, if that land is, there are carbon agreements where there is an allowance to actively manage for saw timber. And this is something we've wrestled with, but we feel like it is to the landowner's benefit to have multiple sources of revenue if they can benefit both from carbon payments while also actively managing for saw timber. Then the intersection of the use value and that carbon agreement may be compatible and they would be eligible. if you take it to another enrollment subcategory and like reserve forest land, and there is a carbon agreement that says you cannot harvest trees for saw timber, but you can deal with water quality, you can deal with introduced invasive plants, then that land does have the ability to manage in a way that's compatible with the enrollment subcategory in which it's enrolled. And so in that specific case, it could be enrolled in that way.
I wanted to mention for context too, that my recollection, Keith, and you can confirm if this matches yours, that when the legislature created this category 4 years ago, there was cooperation with the department, and the administration was this wasn't a battle. This wasn't a bill that the governor vetoed and that our legislature then had to override. That it was something that there was thought to be a shared interest in creating this category.
And you're saying department, PBR and FDR.
FP, Department of Forest Parks, yeah.
Correct.
I've got to step out for a minute. John will take over, but I'll acknowledge John O'Brien before I step out.
I just wondered it as an example, is it called Cold Hollow to Canada?
Yeah.
Is that enrolled in UVA and also potentially looking at?
That's enrolled in UVA. I don't know, many of those have, there are several carbon agreements on parcels. But they are all actively managed. So they're not reserve forest land, they're actively managing for saw timber while benefiting from that carbon arrangement.
And it's like a cooperative, right? Almost a private.
As I understand it, yeah.
Right, just to make up a big enough block to be considered for a carbon deal.
Yeah. To put another example, there is something called Family Forest Carbon. It's nationally one of the larger carbon programs that's available for landowners in the state, or in the country, in the Northeast in particular. It's a voluntary market. There are two practices. One is grow older forest, and one is enhance your woodland. These are 20-year agreements. The grow older forest basically says you won't harvest any trees for a period of 20 years. And the other practice is you're going to maintain a certain level of stocking, which is generally around what we would be managing to anyway, in many cases when we're actively managing for saw timber. And we have made it clear that lands that are participating in the grow older forest, the no harvesting agreement, unless they are in reserve forest land or unless they have lands that are part of ecologically significant treatment areas, they're not eligible for enrollment in UVA with that practice in place. While the other practice, the enhance your woodland, which does allow for active management, they would be allowed to match up participation in that program with enrollment in UVA.
Keith, there's a landowner, I think it's Woodbury, part of it maybe Hardwick, that is like the Northeast Conservation.
Northeast Wilderness Trust?
Yes.
Yes.
So what are any of those Northeast Wilderness Trust lands in UVA?
Yes, they are. And I think this is an important clarification. Reserve forest land is not the first framework within which land being enrolled in the program could be managed for something other than saw timber. For several decades, there's been an enrollment subcategory of managed forest land called conservation land. And conservation organizations like Northeast Wilderness Trust, like the Nature Conservancy and others, can and have enrolled their land and managed it for a variety of conservation values. Some, but very few are actively managed for saw timber. Many have really significant concentrations of ecologically significant features, particularly natural communities or rare, threatened, and endangered species. And others, like Northeast Wilderness Trust, are owning and actively managing their land as for wilderness values. And that is a management opportunity, and that's been allowed in the program for a long time. But it is uniquely available to conservation organizations, 501c3s that have been in business for 5 or more years and are in the business of conserving land.
It's just anecdotal. Those for the working lands, working forest community seem to be the bit of a perceived threat to viability.
I think that's
And
where
it's a loss of a lot of.
That's where when I look at these numbers, 11,000 acres or something like that, and compare it to the whole as a percentage, we can say objectively, it's a small percentage. It's not significant. But when we look at the acres on the ground, it's not an area from that larger whole. It's our backwoods. It's the area across the road, and that feels significant. And that's important to recognize the truth of that. How it's perceived is going to be different depending on where you're coming from.
Keith, are the like 3.5, or what was it, 350,000 of state forest, acres of state forest? Are those forests managed for active saw timber and also a combination of sort of the same management practices in reserve?
There is a range of management objectives, and there are lands that are not actively managed for saw timber, and certainly those that are. And I would want Oliver or Danny or Jim Duncan, my counterpart, to speak to the specifics of that, because they have spent a lot of time talking about that and working through and trying to be very clear with the range of management strategies and objectives that they're using on state lands. And I would hate to muddle that.
Yeah, I mean, just be interesting for us to see if it's sort of mirroring, percentages, like their aspiration is to get to that 9% of open forest on state forest and a certain amount actively managed for saw timber. And then, of course, you've got a lot of elevation issues and
Absolutely.
where, ecologically sensitive, I suppose, like the top of Camel's Hump,
Yeah.
If I may, because I've observed and participated to some degree in like the management plan for the Worcester Range.
Yeah.
FPR is very conservative it's only probably 10% of the acreage that's even in a 20-year management cycle is considered for active management. And that 10% has numerous areas where there are these unique or ecologically sensitive conditions that it may be in that area where there's going to be active management, but the reality on the ground is it's considerably less area because of vernal pools, outcropping, steep slopes, other riparian challenges. So I think FPR, and I've listened to Danny and Oliver testify in environment, and they are committed to do the right thing for wildlife, old growth characteristics, diversified structure. So they're very responsible. The outcry against management gets a lot of oxygen in the media, but the reality is it's it's a false narrative compared to how the FPR is managing their lands. It's just,
Well, that's.
much to the chagrin of some
Right,
of
yeah.
us, or not much to the chagrin, because we all buy into these complex values from a forest.
Well, that's the irony. If you considered the state of Vermont as a property owner who was enrolled in UVA for active saw timber, you know, how that filter would fit over our state forest seems like incredibly conservative, yeah.
Keith, I don't think you were there. You might have been. But this committee a year ago did a field trip to Little River State Forest.
I didn't make it to that.
No, but you were probably the only FPR person who wasn't there. I mean, there were probably 30 staff and ornithologists, everyone, but I think Danny allowed to. And this was a migratory songbird habitat,
Mhm.
harvest little pearl cups. And I think it was like, and it took 12 to 14 years to get from conception to having iron in the forest. But it represented like less than 0.0013% of that Mansfield State Forest. I mean, so that forest can be old growth before there are 4 more cuts. But that really represents how modest the FBR is, or
Yeah.
cautiously moving forward.
We got a few more slides here. Made it through most of the hard numbers, but in terms of acres managed for old forest, there are some who look at this report, look at reserve forest land, and are really looking for more land to be managed in this way. And there are some who look at these numbers and are looking for less or minimal amounts. And so I think it's important to be clear-eyed about both angles on that. So right now, about 10,000 of the acres of the 11,000 acres are managed for old forest conditions and functions across the enrolled property. So there's about 1,000 acres that are of these reserve forest land parcels that are actually managed for something other, largely actively managed for saw timber. So it's in the mix. Talking with the county foresters, there's some subjectivity to how well suited a parcel might be for management for old forest characteristics or for passive management as opposed to actively managed for saw timber. But the sense was these parcels that are being enrolled in reserve forest land have really significant barriers or have really significant features that are worth managing for values other than saw timber. That's not universal, but by and large, that's what folks are seeing. I'm hearing this from consulting foresters as well, who also express concern about this enrollment category where they're coming up and saying, this parcel is perfect for this enrollment subcategory. Think about a parcel that might have a whole lot of operable or productive soils, but it is covered by braided streams with 1,000 stream crossings. It may grow great trees, but in terms of managing it successfully without causing problems, it can be a challenge.
Representative Nelson has his hand up.
Yes.
Richard?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John. This leads me to the whole appraised value, best use appraised value. And landowners so they're not taxed out of their land, having to enroll their lands into programs. Instead of someone with common sense saying, that 35% slope up there with 4 inches of topsoil where it's not bare ledge, growing timber, and then down at the base you have 55 springs and 10 acres and it's wetlands and whatnot. Why can't they just be appraised for what they are? And it's beautiful acreage doing a job that nature intended it to do, and it won't become a ski chalet someday. I just that's part of what bothers me is, and we're a large landowner, and our land is what it is, and unless it's next to sewage and water, and sit in village centers, why are we taxed into having to complete programs over?
I'm not out on a limb because a former commissioner used to say this a lot. Use value appraisal is a Band-Aid. It is attempting to write a difficult, to tax land equitably. And it's, I think, been very successful for the Band-Aid that it is, but it is threading a needle, and what the solution is beyond UVA is wildly complicated. Certainly beyond what I've got the expertise to pontificate on. So I think you're not alone, Representative Nelson, in expressing concern about that, but that's not a problem I'm prepared to solve right now.
Senator Brian? Keith, I wondered either at FPR or PBR if there are projections done on UVA and say subcategories included of how much essentially value the state has to make up because of loss of taxes, because we get into the ed fund here, which is a big deal. And so it was, I thought one of the most interesting things said so far on this whole subject was your brother said it's interesting that we incentivize something that's already happening, as far as there are these forests in Vermont that are, one way or another are going to become what we're aspiring, as a policy them to become. And so it'd be interesting if tax wise, you could say, well, we're not going to have reserve forest subcategory, for example, but towns perhaps could, like Richard says, assessing wise, if these forests aren't worth a lot in a development sense, so you could tax them potentially at much less, but they wouldn't get a tax break, which would be a hit to the ed fund. It would just be interesting sort of to see those numbers.
Property valuation review does the evaluation, or does their report every year, and I think this year was about $76 million total, some portion of that coming from the ed fund. The reason I was looking at the total number of existing enrollments and new enrollments, because those new enrollments constitute arguably a new cost, if that's the way that you're looking at it, and many would argue with that framing of it, but some see enrollment in the program as a cost. The 36 other parcels that were previously enrolled were already participating in the program and don't constitute a new cost. But I think going back to the framing of use value appraisal is covering such a significant part of the landscape. If we have an objective for conditions and values from our forest land, we can't reasonably expect success in advancing or achieving those goals unless it's also compatible and supported by use value appraisal. And it's important for us to be able to say that, and this is true in an individual parcel, that this can be a working lands parcel, even if not every single acre of it is producing saw timber, because there are places on it that are sensitive or special or are being managed for a certain goal. And nobody bats an eye when on this individual parcel, we say there's probably some place that we're not going to run this machinery. that has to happen, I think, on multiple scales. Not just at the parcel level, but on the landscape level to some degree. There are some places that make sense to not necessarily manage for saw timber, even while we say across the landscape, working lands, successful management for saw timber and other values is absolutely critical, and we cannot be compromising in that goal. But it does not mean that every single acre, every single year is getting handled in the same way. In terms of factors limiting enrollment in this enrollment subcategory, we get a lot of complaints from folks that the eligibility thresholds are too steep. I want my land to be enrolled in this subcategory, but it's not eligible. This is one of the coolest parts of this enrollment subcategory. I ask folks, why do you want it to be enrolled in this subcategory? I say, because I want healthy forests, I want it to be diverse, I want it to be wonderful in all these ways. And a lot of times we're able to talk to them and say, we think you may even more successfully advance those goals with some active management. And their resistance to active management for the sake of active management is overcome when they start to see like, oh, wow, this is all one species, or, oh, wow, these are all the same age trees. And it could be better habitat. It could be a better carbon sink. It could be more resilient to all these other factors, not by doing less, but by doing more. And this is really prompting folks to consider that, and it's been a really useful tool in that respect. Awareness and familiarity. This continues to be a new option in the in-use value appraisal. There are a lot of landowners who aren't aware of it. A lot of folks have long expected saw timber management to just be required. It continues to largely be true, but there are now exceptions, and people are not going to be pursuing this immediately. They do a 10-year plan update. They aren't going to incur a cost 8 years before they need to update a forest management plan. There is some involvement to prepare a plan that demonstrates eligibility for this enrollment subcategory. There are more details and more requirements when folks are enrolling in this subcategory. At this point, there are about 28 licensed foresters who have prepared reserve forest land plans. This means that there's more capacity and skill among the profession to provide this service to landowners. The conclusion of our report is basically that this enrollment subcategory is working. It's viable. It's a workable pathway to old forest management within UVA. Active management for saw timber remains the primary eligible condition and management objective on UVA enrolled lands. The creation of this subcategory has not changed that. Education and outreach to landowners and foresters are the primary near-term strategy for growing enrollment. There have been draft bills that have been put forward in past years to expand the eligibility. We don't think that doing that right now makes sense. We continue to recommend a flexible voluntary approach. Mandatory enrollment or management restrictions aren't warranted. And we believe that complementary programs, there are questions about how can you secure the long-term management for old forest characteristics. We stress in the report, don't have UVA do that. Let the other programs, let easements or cost shares or other incentives secure that long-term management strategy if that's in the interest of the landowner. But adding another administrative layer is not something that we would recommend. That's the end of the presentation.
Yeah.
Has there ever been talk of I was just wondering how many parcels in the state are not big enough to qualify for this? And if there's ever been talk of, like a co-oping, like three contiguous little properties of 10
Yeah.
units. Yeah. Could
There,
if they
there
want.
has been draft legislation that's been proposed. I think even in my early years as a county forester, I thought it would be a great idea. I think it would be really nice if it was easy to do. It would not be easy to do. And just the administration of if this grouping of lands is eligible because these three contiguous owners are now coming in, and it's enough work to navigate when one property changes owner and manage the administration and continued enrollment with those transitions. But if you have a aggregated grouping of parcels and there's a change of ownership, what are the units that you're managing? How are you carrying that over? I think it would be paralyzing. And the cost is already really significant, both the administrative costs and financial costs.
Do we know how much of Vermont forests though are captured in those two small parcel?
Well, I think if we say that 3.5 million acres are in private forest land and 2.8 million acres are eligible, then it's somewhere in the remainder. A little bit less than 1,700,000, but it is a huge number of parcels.
Mentioned that earlier, Keith, that the report was submitted back in January to us, and that the data therefore was current as of January or the end of the year, so at some point. Do you know anything more about subsequently in the past 3 months?
No, it's so management plans were due April 1. And so I suspect that there's another batch of reserve forest land plans that are in the mix. And we're still working on getting the administration of tracking these enrollments ironed out. There's the plan receipt that we navigate. There's the application that property valuation review does. And reconciling when things are transition enrollment categories outside of an application process, but instead through a plan update process. There's some administrative processes that we need to navigate to do an appropriate accounting of that. And it's a lot of manual work right now.
Yeah, Chair.
Richard, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Keith, I wonder how many of these small parcels that you're talking about are due to the unintended consequences of Act 250 and 1055 rule, and people creating lots, and you could have a place suitable for a home site, but they made those spaghetti lots that were 10 acres or 25 acres long, and then fragmented the ownership of the forest beyond it. I wonder if some of that's that, if they could have allowed home sites and then put the rest beyond it into a big block like we're talking about. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just one quick one. Land that's neither, say, sort of post-agricultural land, say it was enrolled, but it's not actively working land and farming anymore. It's not a forest. Is there a weird sort of in-between succession going towards forest enrollment potential?
There isn't much of an on-ramp. There is an allowance for a certain portion of a given parcel if at the time of enrollment it's open land. A certain portion of a parcel can be open land and become forest land. It's not infrequent that we have parcels where it's not there yet. And it's exceeding that threshold, and we have conversations with them about planting trees, about accelerating the development of forests, but there is a minimum threshold that parcels need to meet to be eligible, and this is something that we're seeing on a fair number of parcels, especially with some farms going under and
But you need sort of stocking.
you need to have a minimum of 350 stems per acre in order to be eligible.
Keith, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
I don't know whether the legislature in the statute required an annual report or if this was the one and only, but it might be helpful going forward in the future, occasionally to have an update. Absolutely. To see where things are, yeah. And good, thank you.
Thank you.
So we are, I think I wanted to just take a minute to go over 323 and who's going to report on what. We don't have the full committee, so maybe we won't make any final decisions, but this will be moving ahead a little more quickly, I think, just because we are reaching sort of the end. The first three sections in that deal with municipal regulation of agriculture. It's not clear whether we will be amending that section with something else or whether it's going to. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you all.
Whether it's going to be the Senate, you know, our bill that's in the Senate taking the next step. So I guess since I reported on that originally, if that ends up in 323, I'll report on that. Or I'm willing to do that. If somebody else wants to, I don't want to deny anyone the
No, I think.
opportunity.
But it may not look anything like it does right now, right?
Yes, probably will.
Are you
Yeah.
gonna postpone it 5 different times?
Yeah. Yeah, postpone it right till next session, maybe. Hang on a second, I'm gonna.
Are some sections they regard him?
Yes.
But you can exclude me from. I think Richard, others may have been deeply dug in the weeds on that one.
If anybody wants to volunteer to take on the hemp section, yeah. Yeah.
I think Richard would be a good choice.
Okay, Richard, good.
Yeah, someone,
Grower, right? Yeah.
someone that has experience in losing a lot of money with it.
I'm trying to find the blow by blow overview.
Shall I send it to you?
It's posted somewhere. Maybe just not, maybe as a witness testimony.
There's a section in there, you know, pertaining to seeds, which brings me back to my AFICO days. And,
Yeah,
you know, like if no
Okay.
one else wanted to handle that one, I would too. And I think there's a section in there on milk plants and stuff. And our member that serves on Vermont Milk Commission ought to present that one.
That section.
oh, the milk, yeah, could you,
I've just emailed it to everyone.
okay, thank you.
John.
Yeah, well. Have we even gone over or something without milk?
We did go over it, yeah.
What was it?
If a milk plant decides
the
to drop a
processor.
producer.
Not like a milkweed plant.
Yeah.
Talking about-
Yeah, well, let's go through.
Yeah, I could do that.
Let's go through section by section, then we won't be jumping around. So sections 1 through 3, municipal regulation, I will do that. Section 4 is the accessory on farm business. I think we're gonna be deleting that section. Section 5 is milk producers.
Okay,
whatever-
I can do that, yeah.
Yeah. Section, and maybe we can keep sections together. So that section 6 is farm to school program contracts. These are technical changes.
Right, yeah.
So to be very straightforward, pest control, section 7 is pest control compact repeal.
I'm interested in the farm to school, but it sounds like it's really small, so, I mean, if you need someone, you could give me 6 and 7, I don't mind doing
Okay.
both of those. I'd have to look at it and see, because I don't remember all the details.
Pest control compact was 7. These are the technical sections, and then amending the pesticide exam requirements.
Oh, yeah.
That also
That could go with.
fairly technical, yeah.
I'd go with that.
Okay.
Unless John Bartholomew has.
And then seeds are 9 through 14, Richard. And then VIDA. This is just technical stuff, but somebody who needs to be able to answer questions if there are any questions on that.
I would be potentially competent.
You think so?
The lending.
Yeah, okay. That's right. Yes, you have that lending experience. All right, we'll sign Jed up for that.
Borrowing experience.
More borrow. But I did sit on the senior loan committee.
Okay, and then there's a mortgage section, so then hemp follows that, and then there's a brief mortgage section, which you could also probably cover admirably.
Oh, the conservation districts
Yeah,
are eligible for a mortgage.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, that was.
That's a good one.
yeah. Now, Greg, we haven't assigned anything to Greg
And Jack,
or Jack. Yes, we need to give Jack something.
That's
Okay.
our freshman
Let me
pledge.
just ask if anyone weren't included in this bill, would they feel left out or, okay, sad. All right,
Jack does have experience with Vita, I believe.
I bet.
oh, okay,
Yeah, you could do.
I think, I'm not sure.
He could do
He
conservation.
definitely has experience with conservation districts.
okay.
I mean,
Well, I'll consult with Jack and see how comfortable he is with that.
It's one of those times when it doesn't serve you well to be absent.
Yes. All right,
Potentially, we may add. a
Richard, can I talk to you for a minute publicly? Are
Yeah.
you're home, are you going to St. Albans today?
I am not, I am gonna be a dirt farmer.
You spray
And,
chemicals from
I think
here
we
to
can wrap
Labrador?
things up here in committee, so,
All right,
thank you, Patricia, we'll go offline.
we'll see you tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, what time, Jeff?